The funeral parlor fell silent as 12 Marines in dress blues walked through the chapel doors. My stepmother's face went white as they approached my father's casket, their polished boots echoing against the marble floor. She had spent the last 3 days making sure I wouldn't be welcome at my own father's funeral. What she didn't know was that Colonel Samuel Richardson had one final surprise waiting for her. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Victoria Richardson, and until 3 days ago, I thought the worst day of my life was when I received the call about my father's heart attack. I was wrong. The worst day was when my stepmother Patricia informed me that I wouldn't be attending his funeral. The phone call came at 6 in the morning, jolting me awake in my quarters at Camp Pendleton. Patricia's voice was cold, calculated, nothing like the sweet tone she'd used around my father for the past 8 years. "Victoria, I'm calling to let you know that the funeral arrangements have been finalized. It will be a small, intimate gathering for family only." I rubbed my eyes, still processing the news. "Of course, Patricia. What time should I be there? I can catch the first flight out of San Diego." "Actually, that won't be necessary. Samuel's real family will be there to honor him properly. We both know you've been nothing but a disappointment to him." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Excuse me?" "You heard me correctly. Your father spent years trying to understand why you chose the military over a real career. He was embarrassed by your choices, Victoria. The last thing he would have wanted was you making a spectacle of yourself at his funeral." My hands trembled as I gripped the phone. "Patricia, I don't know what game you're playing, but this isn't a game. I'm his wife, and I'm telling you that you're not welcome. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. Samuel Richardson had been my hero long before I knew what the word meant. He'd raised me alone after my mother died when I was 7, working double shifts at the aircraft manufacturing plant to make sure I had everything I needed. When I told him at 18 that I wanted to join the Marines, he didn't try to talk me out of it. Instead, he drove me to the recruitment office himself. "If you're gonna do this, Victoria," he'd said, "then you do it right. Make me proud." And I had. 22 years later, I wore the stars of a brigadier general, the youngest woman ever to achieve that rank in the Marine Corps. My father had been at my promotion ceremony just 6 months ago, tears streaming down his face as I took the oath. The idea that he was embarrassed by my service was so absurd it would have been laughable if it wasn't breaking my heart. I called Patricia back immediately, but the number went straight to voicemail. I tried my father's house, his cell phone, even the funeral home, but somehow Patricia had managed to block every avenue of communication. When I finally reached Hillcrest Funeral Home directly, the director, Mr. Jameson, sounded genuinely apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, General Richardson, but Mrs. Richardson was very specific about the guest list. She's the legal next of kin, and she's made it clear that the service is by invitation only." "Mr. Jameson, with all due respect, that's my father you're talking about. I've been his daughter for 38 years. Patricia has been his wife for 8. "I understand your frustration, ma'am, but my hands are tied. Mrs. Richardson has also requested additional security to ensure the service isn't disrupted." Security. Patricia was hiring security to keep me away from my own father's funeral. The woman who had swooped into my father's life after he'd already raised me, who had barely known him compared to the decades we'd shared, was going to have me physically removed if I showed up. I spent the next hour pacing my small apartment, making calls to anyone who might have influence. My father's older brother had passed away 2 years ago, and his sister lived in a nursing home with advanced dementia. The few cousins I could reach either hadn't spoken to my father in years, or were too intimidated by Patricia to get involved. That's when I remembered Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, my father's best friend from his own brief stint in the Army 30 years ago. Jim had been like an uncle to me growing up, and he'd stayed close with my father even after he'd moved to Arizona for retirement. If anyone could talk sense into Patricia, it would be him. "Victoria, honey, I'm so sorry about your dad." Jim's gravelly voice came through the phone, heavy with grief. "I got the call yesterday. I was planning to drive down for the service. Jim, I need your help. Patricia is trying to ban me from the funeral. She says Dad was embarrassed by my military service." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When Jim finally spoke, his voice was tight with anger. "That's the biggest load of bull I've ever heard. Your father couldn't shut up about you, Victoria. Every phone call, every email, it was always about General Richardson this and General Richardson that. He had your promotion photo framed on his kitchen table for crying out loud. Then you'll talk to her? I'll do better than that. I'm calling your dad's lawyer right now. There's something Patricia doesn't know about your father's will, and I think it's time she found out." 2 hours later, Jim called back with news that shifted everything. My father had updated his will just 3 months ago, adding a codicil that specifically outlined his funeral wishes. He wanted full military honors. He wanted his service medals displayed, and he wanted his daughter, Brigadier General Victoria Richardson, to deliver the eulogy. "Patricia never saw the updated will," Jim explained. "Your dad was planning to tell her about it, but with a heart attack. The lawyer is faxing a copy to the funeral home right now." I felt a mixture of relief and grief so intense it nearly knocked me to my knees. Even in death, my father was still protecting me, still making sure I was taken care of. But there was also a burning anger at Patricia for putting me through this torment, for trying to steal these final moments with the man who had shaped my entire life. The flight from San Diego to Phoenix felt endless. I wore my dress blue uniform, the one my father had been so proud of, with every ribbon and medal I'd earned over 2 decades of service. If Patricia wanted a fight, she was going to get one. But I was determined to honor my father's memory with dignity, regardless of what she threw at me. I arrived at Hillcrest Funeral Home 30 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin. The parking lot was nearly empty. Apparently, Patricia's idea of an intimate gathering meant barely anyone at all. My chest tightened as I realized how many of my father's friends and colleagues would miss the chance to say goodbye because of her selfishness. Mr. Jameson met me at the front entrance, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "General Richardson, I want to apologize for yesterday's conversation. Your father's wishes were very clear, and I should have honored them from the beginning." "Thank you, Mr. Jameson. I appreciate your integrity." "There's something else you should know. Mrs. Richardson arrived an hour ago with 2 private security guards. When I showed her your father's will, she became quite upset. She's threatened to call the police if you attempt to enter the chapel." I squared my shoulders, feeling the weight of my uniform and everything it represented. Let me worry about Patricia. Is everything set up according to my father's wishes? "Yes, ma'am. His medals are displayed, and we've arranged for the flag-folding ceremony. The chapel is ready for your eulogy." As we walked through the funeral home's elegant hallways, I caught glimpses of the small gathering through the chapel's stained-glass windows. I recognized a few faces. Neighbors from my father's street, a couple of guys from his bowling league, his longtime physician, Dr. Martinez, maybe 20 people total, when my father had touched hundreds of lives throughout his 72 years. Patricia stood near the front row, wearing an elaborate black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She was speaking in hushed tones to 2 large men in cheap suits who were obviously the security she'd hired. When she spotted me approaching, her face contorted with rage. "Absolutely not," she hissed, marching toward me with her hired muscle flanking her. "I told you yesterday that you're not welcome here. And I told Mr. Jameson that my father's will supersedes your personal preferences," I replied calmly. "This is his funeral, Patricia, not yours. I'm his wife. I have every right to. You have the right to grieve, just like everyone else here. You don't have the right to deny his final wishes." One of the security guards stepped forward, his hand moving toward my arm. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave voluntarily, or we'll have to escort you out." I looked at this man who was being paid to put his hands on a United States Marine Corps general, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Sir, I would strongly advise you to reconsider your next move." "Lady, I don't care what costume you're wearing, you're trespassing." Costume. This man had just called my uniform, the uniform I'd earned through blood, sweat, and 22 years of service to my country, a costume. The same uniform my father had saluted with tears in his eyes just 6 months ago. That's when the chapel doors opened, and 12 Marines in dress blue uniforms walked in. The sound of 12 sets of polished boots moving in perfect synchronization echoed through the chapel like thunder. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the entrance. The 2 security guards who had been advancing on me suddenly found themselves frozen in place, their eyes wide as they took in the sight before them. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Leading the formation was Colonel Marcus Thompson, my former commanding officer from Camp Lejeune. Behind him walked men and women I recognized from various points in my career. Some I'd served alongside, others I'd commanded, all of them now moving with the precise, deadly grace that only comes from years of military discipline. Patricia's face had gone completely white. What is this?" Colonel Thompson's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years commanding respect. "Ma'am, we're here to pay our respects to Colonel Samuel Richardson and to ensure his daughter receives the honor she deserves." "His daughter?" Patricia's voice cracked. "She's just some soldier who—" "Brigadier General Victoria Richardson," Sergeant Major Elena Rodriguez corrected sharply, stepping forward. "The youngest woman ever promoted to flag rank in the Marine Corps. Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. Distinguished Service Cross. Purple Heart with 3 clusters." Her dark eyes fixed on Patricia with laser intensity. "Show some respect." I stared at Elena in shock. Congressional Medal of Honor? I'd never received that decoration. But as her eyes met mine, I saw something there. A message, a warning, play along. The larger of the 2 security guards cleared his throat nervously. "Look, I don't know what kind of show this is supposed to be, but we have our orders. The lady pays our bills, and she says this woman leaves." Captain Michael Chen, who I remembered as a Green Lieutenant from my time in Afghanistan, stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And who exactly do you think you're going to remove?" "Her," the guard pointed at me with false bravado. "Doesn't matter what rank she claims to have. Money talks." "Money talks," Major Sandra Williams repeated slowly, her voice dripping with disdain. "You know what talks louder? 12 Marines who've served 3 combat tours each and really don't appreciate civilians putting their hands on their commanding officer." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The wedding guests, because that's what they looked like in their designer clothes and jewelry, more suited to a cocktail party than a funeral, began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They were finally beginning to understand that this wasn't some elaborate performance. Patricia found her voice again, though it shook with barely controlled hysteria. "This is ridiculous. Samuel was a factory worker, a simple man who built airplanes. He would be mortified by this military circus." "Ma'am," Colonel Thompson said quietly, "with respect, you didn't know Colonel Richardson at all." "Colonel? He was never a colonel. He worked at Boeing for 40 years. Boeing Defense Systems," Major Williams corrected, "where he held a top-secret security clearance and designed navigation systems for military aircraft. Where he continued to serve his country long after his active duty ended." I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. My father had never told me about any of this. As far as I knew, he'd done his 2 years in the Army right after high school, then moved on to civilian life. But looking at the Marines surrounding me, seeing the respect in their eyes when they spoke his name, I realized there was an entire part of my father's life I'd never known about. "That's impossible," Patricia stammered. "He never said anything about—" "Classified work requires classified silence," Sergeant Major Rodriguez explained. "Even from my family. Especially from a family who can't be trusted with sensitive information." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Patricia's face flushed red, but before she could respond, Mr. Jameson appeared at my elbow. "General Richardson, we're ready to begin the service whenever you are." Patricia whirled on him. "She is not giving any speech. I forbid it." "Ma'am, as I explained earlier, Colonel Richardson's will is very specific about the funeral arrangements. The general is to deliver the eulogy, and full military honors are to be observed." "Full military honors for a factory worker?" Colonel Thompson reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "Mrs. Richardson, your husband's complete service record. 22 years active duty, not 2. Multiple deployments to classified locations. Retired with full honors at the rank of colonel. The Boeing job was his cover for continued defense contract work." Patricia grabbed the envelope with shaking hands, scanning the documents inside. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, cold rage. He lied to me. For 8 years, he lied to me about everything. He protected operational security, Captain Chen corrected, just like he protected his daughter from people who might use her against him. The pieces were starting to fall into place. My father's mysterious business trips that he'd always brushed off as boring work stuff. The way he'd sometimes seemed to know things about my deployments before I had told him. His uncanny ability to give me advice about military situations that should have been outside his experience. The phone calls, I whispered, finally understanding. You were briefing him about my missions. Colonel Thompson nodded. Your father remained on the reserve list as a special advisor. We kept him informed about your status, your safety, your achievements. He was immensely proud, General. More proud than you could possibly know. Patricia crushed the papers in her fists. This is all lies. Some elaborate hoax to make me look like a fool. The only person making you look like a fool is yourself, Major Williams said coldly. Your husband was a decorated war hero who continued serving his country until the day he died. His daughter followed in his footsteps and exceeded even his remarkable achievements. And you tried to ban her from his funeral because you were jealous of a relationship you could never understand. The word jealous hit its mark. Patricia's composure completely cracked. Jealous? Of what? Of some woman who chose guns and violence over having a real family? Samuel wanted grandchildren, not war stories. He wanted a daughter who would give him a legacy, not one who runs around the world playing soldier. The chapel had gone completely silent. Even the security guards looked uncomfortable now, realizing they were caught in the middle of something much bigger than a simple family dispute. Sergeant Major Rodriguez took a step forward, her voice deadly quiet. Ma'am, I'm going to give you one opportunity to apologize for that statement. Apologize? For telling the truth? For insulting every man and woman who's ever worn the uniform? For spitting on the memory of a man who gave 44 years of his life to protecting people like you? For trying to steal the final moments between a daughter and her father? The two security guards were now backing toward the exit, apparently deciding that whatever Patricia was paying them wasn't worth tangling with 12 very angry Marines. Patricia seemed to realize she was completely alone. Fine, she said, her voice rising to near shriek levels. Have your little military funeral. Give your speeches about honor and service. But don't expect me to sit here and listen to it. She stormed toward the chapel doors, but Colonel Thompson's voice stopped her cold. Mrs. Richardson, you'll stay. Excuse me. You're going to sit in that front pew, and you're going to listen to every word of your stepdaughter's eulogy. You're going to show the respect for Colonel Richardson that you should have shown while he was alive. You can't make me do anything. Major Williams smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Ma'am, we're Marines. Making people do things is literally our job description. Patricia looked around the chapel, perhaps finally realizing that she was surrounded by highly trained military personnel who were not particularly fond of her at the moment. The fight seemed to drain out of her all at once. Samuel, she whispered, looking at the casket draped with an American flag that hadn't been there when she'd arrived. Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth? For the first time since this confrontation began, I felt a flicker of sympathy for my stepmother. My father's deception, however necessary for operational security, had clearly wounded her deeply. But that sympathy evaporated when she turned back to me with venom in her eyes. This doesn't change anything between us, Victoria. You may have your military friends to back you up today, but after this funeral, you'll go back to your base and I'll never have to see you again. Actually, Colonel Thompson said, consulting his watch, that's where you're wrong. Patricia frowned. What do you mean? General Richardson has been reassigned. Effective immediately, she'll be taking command of the Marine Corps recruiting station in Phoenix. She'll be living in your father-in-law's house, the one he left to her in his will. The color drained from Patricia's face. That's my house. We lived there together for 8 years. You lived there as Colonel Richardson's guest, Major Williams corrected. The house was never legally yours. According to the will, you have 30 days to relocate. I stared at my colleagues in amazement. How did you arrange a reassignment in 3 days? We didn't arrange anything, Captain Chen said with a grin. The orders came down from the Pentagon yesterday morning, signed by the Commandant himself. Apparently, Colonel Richardson had one final request pending with some very important people. Even in death, my father was still taking care of me, still making sure I would be okay. The grief hit me fresh and sharp, but this time it was mixed with an overwhelming gratitude for the man who had never stopped being my protector, even when I thought I was strong enough to protect myself. Patricia sank into the front pew like her strings had been cut. The fight was completely gone from her now, replaced by the dawning realization that she had underestimated both my father and me in ways that would have lasting consequences. "Shall we begin the service, General?" Mr. Jameson asked gently. I looked around the chapel at the Marines, who had traveled hundreds of miles to honor my father and support me. I looked at the flag-draped casket containing the man who had shaped every important decision of my life. And I looked at Patricia, sitting alone in her expensive dress, finally understanding that she had never really known her husband at all. "Yes," I said, straightening my uniform and walking toward the podium. "Let's give Colonel Samuel Richardson the send-off he deserves." Standing at the podium, I looked out at the small gathering that had been transformed by the presence of my Marine colleagues. What had started as Patricia's intimate farewell had become something my father would have truly wanted. A celebration of his service surrounded by people who understood what that service meant. "Samuel Richardson was a man of secrets," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the chapel's acoustics. Not because he was deceptive, but because he understood that some truths are too precious to share carelessly. I could see Patricia shift uncomfortably in the front row, but I wasn't speaking to her. I was speaking to the factory workers who had known my father as Sam, the reliable guy who always volunteered for overtime. I was speaking to Dr. Martinez, who had treated his arthritis without knowing it came from carrying a full pack across 3 continents. I was speaking to the neighbors who had borrowed his tools and shared backyard barbecues, never realizing they were grilling hamburgers with a decorated war hero. My father taught me that strength isn't about what you can lift or how loud you can shout. It's about what you can carry silently. For 44 years, he carried the weight of classified knowledge, the burden of missions that could never be discussed, and the responsibility of protecting information that could save or cost lives. Mr. Henderson from next door nodded slowly. He'd probably wondered about those mysterious business trips, the phone calls my father would take in another room, the way he sometimes seemed to know things about world events before they hit the news. He also carried something else, the absolute conviction that his daughter could achieve anything she set her mind to. When I told him at 18 that I wanted to be a Marine, he didn't ask me to consider safer options. He asked me what I needed to succeed. The memory hit me fresh, driving to the recruitment office in his old Ford pickup, the radio playing country music while he gave me advice that seemed impossibly wise for a factory worker. Now I understood why his guidance had been so precise, so tactically sound. What I needed, it turned out, was an example. Someone who showed me that service isn't a job, it's a calling. Someone who demonstrated that protecting others sometimes means sacrificing your own recognition. Someone who proved that real heroes don't need parades or public acknowledgement, they need purpose. Colonel Thompson caught my eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. Behind him, the other Marines stood at perfect attention, their presence adding weight to every word I spoke. My father's greatest achievement wasn't the medals he earned or the commendations in his classified file. It was raising a daughter who understood that freedom isn't free, that democracy requires defenders, and that some things are worth more than personal comfort. Mrs. Chen from down the street was crying now, clutching her husband's arm. She'd brought my father soup when he had the flu last winter, never knowing she was caring for a man who had helped design the navigation systems that kept American pilots safe. But Samuel Richardson wasn't just a soldier or an engineer. He was a father who never missed a school play, even when he was exhausted from classified briefings. He was a neighbor who would clear your driveway without being asked. He was a friend who listened to your problems without offering his own in return. I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the small crowd. Patricia sat rigidly upright, her face a mask of controlled emotion. Whatever she was feeling, grief, anger, embarrassment, betrayal, she was keeping it locked down tight. The irony is that my father's greatest fear wasn't enemy fire or failed missions. It was that his need for secrecy would somehow damage his relationship with the people he loved. He worried that the distance required by his clearance level would be mistaken for emotional unavailability. Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly. He'd probably seen that worry in my father during medical appointments, the way classified personnel sometimes struggled with the isolation their work required. What my father never understood was that his love came through in everything he did. It was in the way he taught me to change a tire, not because he doubted my intelligence, but because he wanted me to be self-sufficient. It was in the way he attended every promotion ceremony, not because he needed public recognition for his parenting, but because he was genuinely proud of my choices. The words were coming easier now, flowing from a place of pure gratitude mixed with grief. Behind me, I could almost feel my father's presence, could imagine him standing at attention in his dress uniform, finally able to acknowledge publicly what he'd been privately celebrating for years. It was in the way he supported my military career even when it meant months of separation, dangerous deployments, and sleepless nights wondering if I was safe. He never asked me to choose between loving him and serving my country because he understood they were the same thing. Sergeant Major Rodriguez wiped her eyes quickly, probably remembering her own father's reaction when she'd enlisted. The military is full of children following parents into service, carrying forward traditions of sacrifice and honor. The last conversation I had with my father was 3 weeks ago. He called to tell me about a documentary he'd watched about women in combat roles. He was so excited to hear about the female pilots and officers featured in the program. "Victoria," he said, "you're part of something historic. You're changing the face of military leadership." That conversation had meant everything to me at the time, but now it carried additional weight. My father hadn't just been proud of my achievements. He'd been professionally impressed by them. He'd understood better than anyone the obstacles I'd overcome and the significance of my success. What he didn't tell me during that call was that he'd been fighting his own battle, heart disease, the kind that comes from decades of stress and irregular schedules and carrying burdens too heavy for one person. He was facing his final mission, and he approached it the same way he'd approached everything else, with courage, preparation, and concern for the people he was leaving behind. The chapel was completely silent now except for the soft sounds of crying from various corners. Even Patricia seemed affected by the words, though her expression remained unreadable. My father's will contained specific instructions for this service: full military honors, display of his service medals, recognition of his classified contributions to national security. But it also contained something else, a letter addressed to his daughter to be read only after his burial. This was news to everyone, including Colonel Thompson, who looked surprised for the first time since entering the chapel. I reached into my jacket and pulled out an envelope that Mr. Jameson had handed me just before the service began. He wrote, "Victoria, if you're reading this, then my final mission is complete. I've spent your entire life preparing you to be strong enough to stand alone, but I hope you never have to. The Marines gathered around you today aren't just honoring my memory. They're welcoming you into a brotherhood that transcends death. They understand what I've always known. You don't just wear the uniform, you embody everything it represents." Major Williams stepped forward slightly, a gesture of support that wasn't lost on anyone watching. "I kept my service record classified, not because I was ashamed of it, but because I wanted your achievements to be your own. I never wanted anyone to assume you'd succeeded because of nepotism or family connections. Every promotion you've earned, every commendation you've received, every life you've touched through your leadership, that's all you, sweetheart. That's the daughter I raised and the Marine I've watched with pride." The emotion was threatening to overwhelm me now, but I pushed through, knowing my father would expect me to finish strong. "The house is yours because it's where you learned to dream big. The reassignment to Phoenix isn't a favor from old military friends. It's a recognition that leadership requires being where you're needed most. The recruiting station needs someone who can inspire the next generation of Marines, and there's no one better qualified than someone who's lived the journey from civilian to flag officer." Patricia made a small sound, surprise maybe, or recognition that my father had orchestrated events even beyond his death. "Take care of Patricia if she'll let you. She loved me in her own way, even if she never understood the part of me that belonged to the Corps. Forgive her for trying to protect what she thought was hers. She was fighting a battle she didn't understand against an enemy she couldn't see. This was the hardest part, extending grace to someone who had tried to steal my final moments with my father. But as I looked at Patricia, I saw something I'd missed before: genuine grief mixed with confusion and regret. Finally, remember that every sunrise is a chance to serve, every sunset is a victory if you've made a difference, and every breath is a gift from the Marines who came before us. Live with honor, lead with compassion, and never forget that your old man is still watching your six from a much better vantage point. I folded the letter carefully and looked out at the faces before me, military and civilian, young and old, people who had known different versions of my father, but were united now in their respect for his memory. Samuel Richardson, Colonel, United States Army, father, friend, and guardian of secrets that made America safer. We commit his body to rest, but his legacy lives on in every Marine who serves with honor, every daughter who follows her dreams despite obstacles, and every person who understands that true strength comes from serving something bigger than yourself. The chapel erupted in applause, not the polite golf clap typical of funeral services, but the thunderous recognition reserved for heroes finally receiving their due. Colonel Thompson stepped forward and nodded to his Marines, who snapped to attention in perfect unison. "Present arms," he commanded, and 12 hands moved to crisp salutes. Through the chapel windows I could see that more people had arrived during my eulogy. Word had somehow spread, and the parking lot was now full of cars. Veterans in their dress uniforms, active duty personnel who had driven from various bases, neighbors and co-workers, who wanted to pay their respects to a man they were finally understanding properly. The flag-folding ceremony that followed was flawless, each crease sharp and precise, each movement a testament to training and tradition. When Sergeant Major Rodriguez presented me with the triangle of stars and stripes that had covered my father's casket, she whispered something that only I could hear. "He's been briefed on your next assignment, General. He's prouder than you can imagine." As the service concluded and people began to file out, Patricia approached me slowly. Her earlier hostility had been replaced by something that looked like exhaustion mixed with genuine remorse. "Victoria," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I thought I knew your father, but clearly, I only knew the parts he chose to share with me. I was wrong to try to keep you away from this." It would have been easy to accept her apology and move on, to let the day end on a note of reconciliation. But there was still one more surprise waiting, one final revelation that would change everything Patricia thought she knew about her marriage to my father. "Actually, Patricia," I said, my voice steady, despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me, "there's something else you need to understand about your marriage to my father." She frowned, clearly exhausted by the day's revelations. "What do you mean?" Mr. Jameson appeared beside us, carrying another manila envelope. "Mrs. Richardson, General Richardson, there's one additional document that Colonel Richardson requested be presented after the service." Patricia's face went pale. "More secrets." "Not secrets," Colonel Thompson interjected, having overheard our conversation. "Context." Mr. Jameson opened the envelope and withdrew a thick stack of papers. "Mrs. Richardson, your husband's complete financial records for the past 8 years, including his real salary from Boeing Defense Systems." Patricia accepted the documents with trembling hands. As she scanned the first page, her eyes widened in shock. "This can't be right. Samuel made $60,000 a year at the factory. This says $420,000 annually," Major Williams finished, "plus classified project bonuses that often doubled that amount. That's impossible. We lived modestly, we drove used cars, we shopped at discount stores. If he was making this kind of money, where did it all go?" I felt a chill run down my spine as I began to understand what my father had been doing for 8 years. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place in a way that revealed not just my father's generosity, but his incredible foresight. "Page 12, Sergeant Major Rodriguez suggested quietly. Patricia flipped through the documents, her confusion growing with each page. When she reached page 12, she stopped breathing altogether. "The Victoria Richardson Foundation," she whispered, reading from the paper, established 2019. Purpose: Scholarship Fund for Children of Fallen Service Members. Board of Directors: Samuel Richardson, Chairman. Current assets: $2.8 million. The chapel had gone completely quiet around us. Even the Marines, who had obviously known more about my father than I'd realized, seemed surprised by this revelation. He was donating almost his entire salary, Patricia continued, her voice barely audible, year after year, living on what a factory worker would make and giving away everything else. Captain Chen stepped forward. "Ma'am, your husband was supporting the education of 43 children whose parents died in service to this country. Kids whose college dreams died with their mothers and fathers in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria." "But why didn't he tell me?" Patricia's voice cracked with genuine anguish. "Why did he let me think we were struggling financially? Why did he let me complain about money when he was giving away millions?" "Because he knew you wouldn't understand," I said softly, finally grasping the full scope of my father's character. "He knew you'd try to talk him out of it. He knew you'd want that money for yourselves instead of for Gold Star families." Patricia sank into a nearby chair, the weight of 8 years of misunderstanding crashing down on her. "I complained about everything. The old car, the small house, the vacation we never took. I made him feel guilty for not providing better when he was sacrificing everything for strangers." "Not strangers," Colonel Thompson corrected. "Family. That's what military families are to each other. Your husband understood that better than most." Mr. Jameson produced another document. "There's more, Mrs. Richardson. The foundation isn't just a scholarship fund. Look at page 15. Patricia's hands shook as she turned the pages. Emergency Assistance Fund, housing support, medical expense coverage, grief counseling services. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "Victoria, he built an entire support network. He did it in my name because he wanted me to understand the responsibility that comes with rank," I realized aloud. "Every time I got promoted, every time I achieved something new, he was using it as inspiration to help more families." Major Williams pulled out her phone and showed Patricia a photograph. "This is Jessica Martinez. Her father was killed by an IED in Kandahar 3 years ago. She's now a sophomore at Stanford University, studying engineering. Full scholarship from your husband's foundation." Captain Chen produced his own phone. "This is Tyler Johnson. His mother died in a helicopter crash in Kuwait. He's pre-med at Johns Hopkins. Dreams of becoming a combat medic." Sergeant Major Rodriguez showed Patricia another image. The Williams family. Both parents were killed in separate deployments, leaving 3 children with their grandmother. The foundation paid for the house they're living in and will cover college tuition for all 3 kids. Patricia stared at the photos, seeing face after face of young people whose lives had been transformed by her husband's quiet generosity. "How many?" "Directly impacted? Over 200 families," Colonel Thompson replied. "But the ripple effect goes much deeper. Those college graduates become doctors, teachers, engineers, leaders. They have families of their own, contribute to their communities, serve their country in various ways." "And I never knew any of this," Patricia whispered. "I lived with this man for 8 years and never knew he was changing hundreds of lives." "He wanted to protect you from the weight of it," I said, understanding my father's motivation more clearly now. "Military families carry a special kind of grief, Patricia. It's not something you can explain to someone who hasn't lived it. He didn't want you to feel obligated to carry that burden." "So instead, I carried the burden of thinking I'd married a man with no ambition," she said bitterly. "A man who was content to build airplanes and watch television and never aspire to anything greater." Dr. Martinez, who had been quietly listening to this exchange, spoke up for the first time. "Mrs. Richardson, if I may, your husband came to see me 6 months ago. He was concerned about his heart condition, but he was also worried about you." Patricia looked up sharply. "Worried about me? Why?" "He said you'd been frustrated with your marriage, feeling like he wasn't the man you thought you'd married. He asked me if I thought he should tell you about his real work, his financial situation, the foundation." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that marriages require honesty to survive. But he said something that stayed with me. Doc, some truths are too big for some people to handle. Patricia married a simple man who loved her. If she finds out he's actually someone else entirely, she might feel like she's been living with a stranger." The irony was crushing. My father had kept his secrets to protect Patricia's image of him, but in doing so, he'd created exactly the distance she'd been complaining about. "There's one more thing," Mr. Jameson said quietly, producing a final envelope. "Mrs. Richardson, this is addressed to you specifically. Your husband wrote it to be opened only if something happened to him." Patricia took the letter with hands that could barely hold steady. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting that would never pen another word. "My dearest Patricia," she read aloud, her voice breaking. "If you're reading this, then my time has ended, and you're finally learning the truth about the man you married. I know you feel betrayed right now, and you have every right to be angry with me." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes before continuing. "I never told you about my continued military service because I wanted you to have a normal life. I wanted you to worry about ordinary things like grocery bills and car payments, not about classified missions and national security threats. I wanted you to sleep peacefully at night, not wondering if your husband's work was putting you in danger." Patricia's voice was barely a whisper now. "I never told you about the foundation because I was afraid you'd try to talk me out of it. You have a generous heart, Patricia, but you also have practical concerns about our future. I knew you'd worry about our retirement, our security, our ability to travel and enjoy our later years together." The chapel was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. What I failed to understand was that by protecting you from my world, I was denying you the chance to be part of something meaningful. I was underestimating your capacity for understanding and sacrifice. I was treating you like someone who needed to be shielded, rather than someone who could be trusted. Patricia looked up from the letter, her face streaked with tears. "He thought I was too weak to handle the truth." "He thought you were too precious to burden with it," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." She returned to the letter. "I hope that after today you'll understand why Victoria means so much to me. She's not just my daughter. She's my legacy in uniform. Every achievement of hers validates every sacrifice I've made, every secret I've kept, every mission I've completed. She is proof that my service mattered." Colonel Thompson stepped closer, his expression softening. "Ma'am, your husband talked about you constantly. Every phone call, every briefing, he'd find a way to mention something you'd said or done. He was proud of you too." "Proud of what?" "I never accomplished anything important." "You made a war hero feel normal," Sergeant Major Rodriguez said simply. "You gave him a home where he could forget about classified briefings and deadly missions. You gave him 8 years of peace in a life that had been defined by conflict." Patricia returned to the letter for the final paragraph. "I've arranged for you to be financially secure for the rest of your life, but I've also arranged for the foundation to continue its work. Victoria will take over as chairman, not because she has to, but because she'll want to. She understands the weight of service in ways that I pray you'll never have to learn firsthand." She folded the letter carefully, her hands steadier now. "There's a P.S., she said quietly. "Patricia, forgive an old soldier for one final mission. Please don't let my secrets destroy your relationship with Victoria. She's going to need family now more than ever, and despite everything that's happened today, you're still family. Be the mother she never had, and let her be the daughter you never got to raise." The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. Patricia looked at me with eyes that held a complex mixture of grief, regret, and something that might have been hope. "Victoria," she said slowly, "I don't know if we can ever have the relationship your father wanted for us. But I'd like to try to understand who you really are, instead of resenting who I thought you were." It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a beginning. And as I looked around the chapel, at the Marines who had become my surrogate family, at the civilians who were seeing military service in a new light, and at Patricia who was finally seeing my father clearly, I realized that this funeral had become something none of us had expected. It had become a bridge between two worlds that my father had spent his entire life trying to protect from each other. And maybe, just maybe, that bridge would prove to be his greatest legacy of all. "There's one more surprise," Captain Chen said with a grin that suggested the day's revelations weren't quite finished. "General, you might want to look outside." Through the chapel windows I could see that the parking lot had been filled with people during our conversation. Hundreds of people, many in uniform, others in civilian clothes, all standing at attention in the Arizona sun. "Word travels fast in the military community," Major Williams explained. When Marines heard that Colonel Richardson's daughter was finally getting the recognition she deserved, they decided to come pay their respects. But how did they know? Colonel Thompson smiled. General, your father may have kept secrets from his wife, but he never stopped talking about you to his brothers in arms. Every base in the Southwest has heard stories about General Victoria Richardson. Today, they came to meet the legend. Patricia stood up slowly, looking out at the crowd that had gathered to honor both my father and me. I think, she said quietly, I'm finally beginning to understand what kind of man I married. And what kind of daughter he raised. As we prepared to leave the chapel for the burial ceremony, I realized that my father's final mission was far from over. It was just beginning, and it would continue long after the last salute was rendered and the final folded flag was presented. The foundation would grow, the scholarships would multiply, and somewhere, children who had lost their parents in service to their country would get the chance to dream again. That, I understood now, was what my father had been fighting for all along. The burial ceremony that followed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. What began as Patricia's attempt at an intimate, private farewell had transformed into something resembling a state funeral. As we processed from the chapel to the graveside, I counted over 300 people lining the pathway, their silence more powerful than any words could have been. The honor guard from Davis-Monthan Air Force Base had arrived during our chapel service, bringing with them a precision and dignity that spoke to my father's true standing in the military community. 7 Marines in dress blues flanked the casket, their movements synchronized to perfection as they carried Colonel Samuel Richardson to his final resting place. Patricia walked beside me, no longer the hostile stranger who had tried to ban me from the funeral. The woman next to me moved with the careful steps of someone whose entire worldview had shifted in the span of a few hours. Every revelation about my father had stripped away another layer of the life she thought she'd been living. I keep thinking about all the times I complained, she whispered as we followed the procession. All the times I made him feel guilty for not taking me to expensive restaurants or buying me jewelry. Meanwhile, he was putting kids through college. He never wanted you to feel guilty about enjoying your life together, I replied, remembering the joy in my father's voice whenever he talked about their quiet evenings together. That was the whole point of keeping it separate. As we approached the burial site, I noticed familiar faces scattered throughout the crowd. General Harrison from the Pentagon, whom I recognized from news coverage but had never met personally. Admiral Chen from the Navy's Special Operations Command. Congressman Rodriguez, who served on the House Armed Services Committee. These weren't people who attended random funerals. They were here specifically to honor my father's classified contributions to national security. The sight that took my breath away, however, was the section reserved for scholarship recipients from the Victoria Richardson Foundation. Young men and women in their 20s, some in military uniforms, others in civilian clothes that spoke of professional success. They held photographs of their fallen parents, creating a visual reminder of the lives my father's generosity had touched. A young woman approached me as we took our positions beside the grave. General Richardson? I'm Jessica Martinez. My father was Staff Sergeant Carlos Martinez, killed in Afghanistan in 2021. I remembered her from the photographs Major Williams had shown Patricia. Jessica, you're at Stanford now, studying engineering. Graduating next month, actually, and I wanted you to know that your father didn't just pay for my education. He sent me birthday cards every year, Christmas gifts, care packages during finals week. He made sure I never felt forgotten. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My father hadn't just been writing checks. He'd been actively involved in these children's lives, providing the emotional support that money alone couldn't buy. There are dozens of us here today, Jessica continued, gesturing toward the group of young adults. Kids who lost parents in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, training accidents. Your father knew all our names, all our stories. He came to graduations when he could, sent congratulation cards for achievements, offered advice when we needed guidance. Patricia overheard this conversation, and I watched her face crumple with fresh understanding. He was basically a surrogate father to all of you, she whispered. More like a grandfather, said a young man who had joined our conversation. I'm Marcus Williams, lost both parents in separate deployments when I was 12. Your husband helped my grandmother raise 3 kids, but he also taught me how to change a tire, helped me with college applications, walked me through my first job interview over the phone. He never mentioned any of this, Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion. He wouldn't, Marcus replied. Mr. Richardson always said that helping someone wasn't about getting credit. It was about making sure the job got done right. The military chaplain called for attention, and the crowd settled into respectful silence. But before the burial service could begin, General Harrison stepped forward. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding large audiences. "Colonel Richardson's family deserves to understand the full scope of his service to this nation." He withdrew a leather portfolio from his dress uniform. By order of the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense, Colonel Samuel Richardson is posthumously awarded the Defense Superior Service Medal for exceptional meritorious service in support of national security operations spanning 4 decades. The crowd stirred with surprise. Posthumous military decorations were rare, especially for someone whose service had been largely classified. Additionally, General Harrison continued, in recognition of his extraordinary charitable work supporting Gold Star families, Colonel Richardson is posthumously awarded the Secretary of Defense Medal for exceptional civilian service. 2 Marines stepped forward carrying a presentation case containing the medals. General Harrison handed them to me with a salute that I returned automatically, still processing the magnitude of what was happening. "General Richardson," he continued, "your father's final classified report, submitted 3 weeks before his death, recommended a complete restructuring of family support services for fallen service members. His proposal, based on 8 years of direct interaction with Gold Star families through his foundation, has been approved for implementation across all branches of the military." Patricia gripped my arm, her understanding of my father's impact growing with each revelation. The man she'd thought was wasting his retirement watching television had actually been researching and developing military policy that would affect thousands of families. "The Samuel Richardson Protocol," General Harrison announced, "will ensure that no child who loses a parent in military service will face financial barriers to education, and no Gold Star family will navigate their grief without comprehensive support services." The applause that erupted from the crowd was spontaneous and thunderous. Veterans who had driven from bases across the Southwest, civilian contractors who had worked with my father on classified projects, neighbors who were finally understanding who had been living among them, all of them recognizing that they were witnessing something historic. As the applause died down, Admiral Chen approached the microphone. "There's one more honor to be bestowed today," she announced. "General Richardson, by unanimous vote of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you are hereby appointed as the first director of the Samuel Richardson Foundation for Military Family Support, a new Pentagon initiative, funded by congressional appropriation." I stared at her in shock. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand." "Your father's private foundation will be absorbed into a federal program with a $50 million annual budget," she explained. "You'll oversee the expansion of scholarship programs, family support services, and grief counseling initiatives for all branches of the military. It's a flag officer position based here in Phoenix, allowing you to honor your father's memory while continuing his work." Patricia was crying openly now, finally comprehending the full magnitude of my father's legacy. "He planned all of this," she whispered. "Even his death was a mission." The burial service that followed was conducted with full military honors. The folding of the flag was performed by a detail from my father's old unit, each crease precise and purposeful. When they presented me with the triangle of fabric that had covered his casket, the lead Marine whispered, "From all of us who served with the Colonel, thank you for being the daughter he always said you were." As dirt was ceremonially sprinkled on the casket, I noticed that many of the Foundation scholarship recipients had brought small items to leave at the grave: graduation photos, acceptance letters to graduate school, wedding invitations, birth announcements, tangible evidence of the futures my father had made possible. Marcus Williams placed a framed photograph beside the headstone. "My daughter Emma," he explained to Patricia and me, "born last month. I named her Emma Samuel Williams, after the man who made sure I lived long enough to become the father I wanted to be." The ceremony concluded as the sun was setting over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed appropriate for a warrior's farewell. As the crowd began to disperse, small groups formed around the gravesite, sharing stories and memories of how my father had touched their lives. Patricia and I remained after most others had left, sitting on chairs provided by the funeral home, neither of us ready to leave my father behind. "I have a confession," Patricia said quietly. "I was planning to contest the will. I was going to fight you for the house, the foundation, everything. I thought you were some stranger trying to steal my husband's legacy. And now? Now I understand that you are his legacy. Everything he worked for, everything he sacrificed for, it was all to make sure you could continue the mission after he was gone." She reached into her purse and pulled out a set of keys. "These are to the house, your house. I'll be moved out by the end of the week." "Patricia, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. I've spent 8 years living in a home that was never really mine, married to a man I never really knew. It's time for me to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to change someone else." She stood up slowly, gathering her composure with visible effort. "There's something else. I want to volunteer for the foundation. I don't have military experience or advanced degrees, but I know what it's like to feel excluded from someone's real life. Maybe I can help other military spouses understand what they're really part of." The offer surprised me, but as I thought about it, I realized she might be uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between military and civilian perspectives that my father had struggled with his entire marriage. "We could use someone who understands the challenges of military families from the spouse's perspective," I agreed. "Someone who knows what it feels like to love someone whose whole life you can't fully access." As Patricia walked away, her high heels clicking against the cemetery's paved pathways, I remained beside my father's grave as darkness settled over the desert. The Foundation scholarship recipients had left a solar-powered lantern that cast a gentle glow over the headstone, ensuring that Colonel Samuel Richardson would never rest in complete darkness. My phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Thompson. "General, your new quarters are ready at the recruiting station. The Foundation office is set up next door. Your father would be proud of what happens next." I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress uniform and preparing to leave my father for the last time. But as I walked toward my rental car, I realized this wasn't really goodbye. Everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed for, everything he had dreamed of, it was all just beginning. The recruiting station where I would spend the next phase of my career was just 5 miles from the cemetery. Close enough that I could visit regularly, far enough that I wouldn't be living in the shadow of grief. My father had thought of everything, even in death, ensuring that his daughter would have the support she needed to carry on his work. As I drove through the gates of the cemetery, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of the lantern still glowing beside my father's grave. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of expanding his foundation into a national program that would help thousands of military families. I would take his private mission and turn it into public policy that would outlast both of us. But tonight, I was simply a daughter who had finally understood the full measure of her father's love. A love so deep that he had spent his final years building a bridge between his military life and his civilian life, between his classified service and his public legacy, between the hero he had always been and the man Patricia had thought she married. The 12 Marines who had walked into that chapel to support me had been following his final orders. Patricia's exclusion from the funeral had been the catalyst that forced all of his secrets into the open, allowing his true legacy to emerge from the shadows where it had been hidden for so long. My father had orchestrated his own funeral to become the moment when two worlds finally collided, creating something bigger and more meaningful than either could have been alone. In death, he had accomplished what he'd never quite managed in life, bringing together everyone he loved to understand and appreciate the full scope of who he really was. And as I drove through the Phoenix night toward my new life, I realized that Colonel Samuel Richardson's final mission had been his most successful yet. He had ensured that his death would not be an ending, but a beginning, the foundation upon which his daughter would build a legacy worthy of the man who had made it all possible. 3 weeks later, I stood in the newly renovated Foundation headquarters, watching as the first class of Foundation counselors completed their training. Patricia had surprised everyone by excelling in the program, her natural empathy and hard-won understanding of military life, making her an invaluable resource for newly widowed spouses. "General Richardson," she called out during a break in the session, We've received another batch of applications from overseas families. Apparently, word is spreading through the deployed units. The foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Congressional funding had attracted matching donations from defense contractors, veteran organizations, and private citizens who wanted to honor my father's memory. What had started as his personal mission to help a few dozen families had become a movement affecting thousands. Jessica Martinez had graduated from Stanford with highest honors and accepted a position as the foundation's engineering education coordinator. Marcus Williams was completing his medical degree while serving as a peer counselor for children who had lost parents in combat. The ripple effect of my father's generosity was creating waves that would last for generations. Every evening, I would drive past the cemetery on my way home to the house that now felt truly mine. The solar lantern still glowed beside my father's headstone, but it was no longer alone. Families would often visit during the day, bringing their children to meet the man who had changed their lives. The grave had become an unofficial shrine to the power of quiet heroism. Patricia had moved into a small apartment near the foundation office, claiming she wanted to be close to the work. But I suspected she also wanted to be close to the sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for so long. She had found her own mission in helping others navigate the complex world of military grief and recovery. On the 1-month anniversary of my father's death, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note from General Harrison and a small wooden box. The note read, "General Richardson, your father left specific instructions for this to be delivered 30 days after his funeral. He said you would understand its significance when the time was right." The box contained my father's original dog tags from his first enlistment, worn and scratched from decades of service. But attached to the chain was something new, a small metal medallion engraved with the Foundation's logo and the words, "Mission Continues." That evening, I wore those dog tags for the first time as I delivered my inaugural address as director of the Samuel Richardson Foundation. Standing before an audience of military families, government officials, and the 12 Marines who had walked into that chapel to change everything, I spoke about the difference between serving your country and serving your purpose. My father taught me that true leadership isn't about the rank you wear or the orders you give, I concluded. It's about the lives you touch when nobody's watching, the sacrifices you make when nobody's counting, and the legacy you leave when everybody thinks your mission is over. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but what moved me most were the faces in the audience. Young people whose futures had been secured by my father's vision, spouses who had found community in their grief, children who would grow up knowing that their parents' sacrifice had not been forgotten. Title. As I left the stage that night, I touched the dog tags hanging beneath my uniform. Colonel Samuel Richardson's final mission was indeed complete, but his daughter's mission was just beginning. And somewhere in the Arizona desert, a solar lantern continued to glow, marking the grave of a man whose greatest victory had come after his last battle was fought. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.